Well, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Richard Johnson. I'm the director of the Booker T. Washington Initiative at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And we're glad to have with us today a wonderful group of individuals who've worked very hard in trying to make sure that every parent has the right and the choice to make the best possible educational options for their children. And we have some researchers here with us today. And I want to introduce everybody. Let me start with Dr. Michael O. Adams. He's a professor of political science and the director of the Executive MPA program at Texas Southern University. Thank you, Dr. Adams, for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
And we have Dr. Mark Jones, political science fellow at the Baker Institute for Public Policy and senior research fellow at the Hobby School of Public Affairs. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Jones.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And we're also joined by Bishop Charles Flowers, pastor of the Outreach International Center in San Antonio, Texas.
Glad to be here.
And we are joined by a mother of three and a macro social worker, as well as a community organizer in Houston, Miss Regina Gardner. Thank you for being here with us. And so we're going to start off with Dr. Jones. Tell us a little bit about the survey and the research study that you and Dr. Adams collaborated with at Texas Southern University and University of Houston, looking at school, what we call ESA, Education Savings Accounts. Now, they used to be called vouchers. But tell us a little bit about those, the study.
Well, this is part of a broader study. It's the third one. It's called the Texas Trends Project that the University of Houston's Hobby School and the Texas Southern University's Jordan Leland School have been conducting. We have different modules, so we look at different topics. One of those was the issue of school choice or vouchers. So we focused in on a series of questions to better understand the preferences of Texans related to the issues of school choice and vouchers. And one of the interesting aspects of the Texas Trends Project is that it's a larger sample size, just standard than you normally have, 1,800 as opposed to 1,200 or 1,000. And we have an oversample of African-American respondents. So you're able to better look at a granular level of support for issues within the African-American community, which normally represents in a standard survey, say 12 or 13%. And so in terms of cases, around 100, 125 cases, which isn't really enough to do intra-group analysis. In our case, we have over 300 cases, or actually over 400 cases. So we can actually look at African Americans as a separate group and look at intra-level differences, say in terms of church attendance, in terms of partisanship, in terms of ideology.
And I want us to talk a little bit about the oversampling of the African American group and the data that followed the African American community. Dr. Adams.
Yeah, we'll start here. Again, just to add on to what Mark said, that these surveys and the collaborative effort with Mark and also the Hobby School, normally we look at trends in terms of what's happening in terms of politics and public policy, and generally we don't get many surprises. But here in this particular case, in terms of the educational school savings account, it was somewhat surprising to see the African American support in this particular case. And as you look at it in terms of African Americans, in terms of their support, in terms of partisanship in political parties, and to see what has been happening coming out of the general session and also the special session in terms of how the partisan breakdown has been on the issue of education. And education in terms of school savings accounts, or whether you call it vouchers or what have you, it has become, to many people, a kind of civil rights issue. Why is that the case? And I think that's why we have to look at these numbers and what does it speak to in terms of the asynchronous in terms of what's happening within the Democratic Party and party support on public policy issues, and whether or not they are really aligned with what we could define as an agenda item in terms of public policy issues that resonate within the African American community.
There are a couple of numbers that really just kind of jumped off the page at me when I looked at that, and looking at the heading, University of Houston and Texas Southern survey finds support highest among black voters, churchgoers, and parents of young children. And when I looked at your data, Dr. Jones, and it basically shared with me that 60% of the folks that attend church at least one time a week supported school choice.
That's correct. So that the groups, so people who attend church are much more likely to support vouchers, as we call them, or school choice, than are people who don't attend church at all or seldom attend church. It's just as people who have children and school-age children living at home are more likely to support vouchers than those who not. And we saw this both in the general population as well as within the African-American community. So this is something that applies to all Texans, but also especially to African-American Texans, where you also have a larger share, especially for Democrats who attend church on a regular basis. I think, as Michael pointed out, one of the real sort of interesting findings here is the strong difference within the Democratic Party, where you have sort of 57% of Black Democrats supporting vouchers compared to only 39% of white Democrats. And then likewise, only a fifth of Black Democrats opposing vouchers, 22%, compared to almost half of white Democrats. So there's a real sort of split within the Democratic Party that you don't see within the Republican Party, where the differences between African Americans, Latinos, and whites are relatively modest. If any, African Americans tend to support vouchers on the Republican side more than other Republicans, but it's a small number. But on the Democratic side, it's a pretty massive gulf separates Black Democrats in terms of the voters from white Democrats. And that part of that has to do with, I don't know, we don't have exact emphasis, but some of it has to do with church attendance.
Yeah. And one of the things I was able to see, Dr. Adams, here in your study also is that 57% of Black Democrats support school choice, and as opposed to 56% of white Republicans. So Black Democrats kind of just slightly above white Republicans in terms of supporting school choice.
Yeah, and I think we have to go back and look at some of the issues in terms of what we see with public education, what we've seen in Texas and also nationally. In terms of, if you look at African Americans, and I mentioned civil rights, but historically we've always valued education as being that vehicle in terms of escaping poverty and many of the challenges that we have to deal with. And it has always been that segue to the middle class. And what we have to talk about is quality education. And what we've seen in recent years, and even if you look at where we are here in Houston, Mark and myself, in terms of the takeover of the largest public school district, and there have been legislation passed in terms of performance and these kinds of things. So I think African American parents are no different than any other parents in terms of expecting quality and a good education for their kids. And so I think if you look at it, and also I think it exceeds socioeconomic standing within the community in terms of income level. We know that there's a lot going on in terms of lower income African Americans. How do we address their needs and how do we help them if we don't look at the education system and making sure that it's quality based and that they would be able to get a good education where they could either go into the workforce or matriculate in terms of higher education for success.
One of the other things that I saw, Dr. Jones, is that the study revealed that the larger percentage of parents who had children living at home with them support school choice.
That's correct. And that combines with people who also follow K through 12 news more closely. So the people that are most invested, most involved with public schools are at least with children of school age, are the ones who are most supportive of school choice or vouchers. I think that links back to something I forgot to say earlier, that often within the Democratic Party, the two principal critiques launched against vouchers or school choice are one, that it would send funding to religious schools, and the other is that it would undermine and reduce the quality of the existing schools. if you think about the fact that a majority of these African Americans are frequent churchgoers, the issue of the money going to religious schools is much less of a problem for them than it is for more secular white Democrats. And then likewise, many of the schools, as Michael was pointing out, in the areas where they live are suffering significant problems where I guess the critique that somehow it's going to make the schools worse rings a little more hollow than it may in some suburban areas.
One of the things I want to also talk about now is the disconnect. The disconnect between what the African American voters actually want and what the African American elected officials, the direction that they're going into. One of the things that we've also noticed here in the study is that pretty much every one of the black Democrats or the black elected officials here in the legislature have opposed school choice. And they've opposed it overwhelmingly, while at the same time, a significant amount, the larger percentage of the folks in the black community are asking for school choice or in favor of school choice. So there appears to be a disconnect between the leadership and the constituency. And so, I've brought a couple of the constituents here in with us today. We have Bishop Flowers here, and just I want you to talk a little bit about the school that you started at your church and what school choice or education savings accounts will do for you moving forward.
Yes, Dr. King included the idea of not only just an academic education, but a moral one. Both a moral and an academic education is what is needed for students in all communities, especially for students in minority communities, because they're challenged with so much. So the schools should be reinforcing the same academic rigor and moral standards that they're hearing at the dinner table. But if they're going to school and they're hearing something the exact opposite, it actually pits the classroom against the parents. And that struggle between who the child is going to believe shouldn't be a problem. The child is more than likely going to lean in the direction of his teacher because they're quote unquote educated, and their parents may not be educated. So then there's a tug and a pull between what is being taught at home and what is being taught in the school system. But for us, for our school, this was back in 1983 when we started our school, and we held that school for 15 years. But it became such a challenge for parents to both pay their property taxes, and then on top of that, which support our schools, and then on top of that, pay a private tuition. And it just became too much for them, so we regretted it. One of the saddest things we've had to do is to close the school. But parents are waiting for an opportunity to return their children back to an academic environment that has academic rigor, but also morally reinforces what the standard is in their household. So I'm not surprised that the data speaks to church-going people who support school choice.
And one of the things that I'd like for you to do, Bishop Flowers, is, obviously the folks up on the Hill in the black community have not heard. If they heard, they're obviously going in another direction in terms of the voice away from the voice of the people. If you had an opportunity to speak to those black legislators right now, I just want you to take a moment and say what you would say to them based on the data that we're seeing right here, because obviously you're speaking for a lot of folks in the Christian community and in the faith community. What would you say to those 17 black House members that may or may not be voting for this bill?
I probably wouldn't give them the benefit of the doubt that you've given them, which is that they haven't heard. They certainly have heard. They've heard from a lot of folks that in their own among their own constituencies that want school choice. But those same folks don't often fund their campaigns. It's the school unions that fund their campaigns, and it's the school unions that want to keep districting the way it is. I was thinking about this the other day. You sent me some data concerning, and I thought de-districting today is equal to desegregation a generation ago. So if I was willing to desegregate schools a generation ago, why am I not willing to de-district schools now? Because the process is, and I think it was Dr. Adams who spoke to this, that it's a civil rights issue. And it is a major civil rights issue of the day, that if I can't, why shouldn't I have the right, and 37 or 39 of the states are already participating in some kind of educational savings accounts?
30 states, yeah.
Over 30 states. So what's the problem? Why would there be the problem to extend the same luxuries to the students of Texas? So I would say to those elected officials to begin to listen to what they have heard. You can hear a thing and not listen to it. But if they would listen to the voice of their constituencies and see how it might even speed along them reaching some of what they may have a desire in their heart to do, which is improve the lives of those that they're overseeing. This certainly would do that. So why would they not? Would be a question. I would place more of my statement to them in a question form rather than in a statement. Why wouldn't you support school choice given the data that has come forward?
Ms. Gardner, education freedom. Education freedom is the fight and the mantra of the day. You just heard Bishop Flowers as well as Dr. Adams say this is the civil rights movement of our time. And the question comes to you, you're a mother of three, and you're a community organizer, and you're out in the community, and you know a lot of folks. And you've spoken with some of, just as Bishop Flowers, you've spoken with some of the black legislators. And seeing this data, seeing that the majority of black folks in the state of Texas want to support education freedom and ESAs, education savings accounts, what has been your experience?
Well, my experience started many years ago when I was a young mother with young kids trying to find the best education for my kids. And so I remember just going from website to website to figure out to line up which were the best schools in the Houston area, to find out which one of them. At that time, it was magnet schools is what they had for school choice. And so I was looking for the best magnet school that I could apply to for my kids, because we were living in the same community that I grew up at. So the school down the street when I was growing up was perfectly fine. Like the community was all on the same page in terms of accountability, accountability from house to house, neighbors, and the folks, the teachers and the administrators at the school were all on the same page in terms of behavior, in terms of curriculum and things of that nature. But we returned to that same community, and I had my kids there. And realistically, I was not going to send my kids to that school because the standards have fallen so short. And so I remember filling out all of these different applications and just hoping and praying that somebody was going to let my kids come, And so we did. We got into a magnet program, and it really helped my kids. It made all the difference. They were going to a fine arts program. They were able to learn how to play violin. They just had so many other resources and opportunities there that they weren't going to be able to get in the neighborhood school. And so, and now my kids are grown, and I have grandkids. And so I'm working with my daughter and my grandkids to find, I've seen her go through the same process, trying to find the best school for her kids. And she doesn't even have what I had at my fingertips. She doesn't have that. Because even when, first off, just knowing that wages haven't even kept up with inflation in society, she's struggling the same way that I did, but it's even harder on her. And that reach to get to that school where she can provide better education for her kids, it's not there.
Dr. Jones, I know that you probably saw this in your research when you were conducting this survey. You're hearing the voice of the church, and you're hearing the voice of the community and the mothers in the community. Why do you think there's a disconnect and that the legislators, there are 17 black state representatives and 2 black state senators. Why have they not gotten this message? And do you think are they beating down your door for this research and these results?
No one's been beating down my door for the results.
They're not tone deaf, are they?
No, I mean, I think at the end of the day, you alluded to some of this already, in that the Democratic Party in Texas has a pretty strong position, and it's pretty much inflexible position on school choice. That is, it's against it. So any African-American Democrat legislator who would go against that is going to be punished or at least looked at negatively by their fellow lawmakers. At the same time, a lot of the money, either, as Bishop Flowers mentioned, either comes from the unions or special interest groups so that effectively are very pro-public schools and fund candidates who essentially are against vouchers or against school choice. And so they're afraid that if they somehow are seen as anti-choice or as pro-voucher, that will invite a Democratic challenge that will be funded by the unions, both in terms of funds, but also boots on the ground, and then also by a lot of these interest groups that will fund them as well. And so I think for a lot of them, it's probably a sort of self-preservation. And then I think others are more in line with the Democratic opinion, even though within the party that is anti-school choice.
Dr. Adams.
Yes.
I really want you to help me understand, it seems to me if I were running for public office and I saw the data that said the majority of the African, because most of these districts are safe districts. Most of these districts are safe districts. Most of them are African-American districts. Most of them are Democrat districts. And I saw that the larger percentage of the Democrats in my district or in my area, in my county, because I looked at your data dealing with Dallas County and Harris County, and I was a state representative. I would say the majority of my people are going this way. Why am I going this way?
Yeah, because I tell my students all the time that politicians are only concerned about 2 things. That's election and re-election. And so they often have this fear that if they're not in sync with the party line, that they would be primaried or they would get opposition. And there seems to be the beginning of the disconnect between their constituents and the office holders. But I think the mother that you have there, she's alluded to it already, that there's already choice if you look at it in HISD. Because I know the neighborhood that I live in, and for the high schools, for years, the parents will always try to get their students, if they can get them in Bel Air, they will do that as opposed to sending them into one of the neighborhood schools. And I think even if you were probably to take a poll of members of the Black Caucus and ask them where they send their kids, they probably would be private schools, and also they would get
probably 90%.
If you think about it. But it comes the kind of economic divide that I think we see in our community. And this is what I think part of the challenge is. And also from a historical standpoint, we have to admit that there has been this whole civil rights battle in terms of trying to get into public schools. And I grew up in a city where there was a dual school system, and you wanted to have fair access to a quality education. You wanted to make sure that the funding was equitable. All right, so these things are not always in the equation, and I don't think that the politicians are in the business of educating their constituents. We don't see a lot of, I haven't seen, and I live between the University of Houston and Texas Southern University, in terms of town hall meetings where legislators will come back between the sessions and talk about these kinds of things. I don't recall one where my state representative or my state senator has had one of these kinds of meetings to talk about the issues that have been called on the agenda of the special session.
One of the things I'm seeing here, Bishop Flowers, is we now have data. We now have data basically sharing with us what we kind of knew through naturalistic observation. You know, just through observing, you can tell pretty much the pulse of the community. But now we have actual data from University of Houston and Texas Southern University, you know, credible public policy institutions. Do you think that the African American elected officials will now be willing to listen to some informed policies and make a change, or do you think they'll stay with the party line?
Well, I'm grateful to be able to say that I visited an African American representative in my city, a Democrat woman who championed school choice. She was for it. In fact, she felt like, and this woman also sits as the head over a charter school system that is K through 12th grade. And she felt like that this move is eventually just inevitable anyway, given 30 plus other states are already participating in some form of school choice. And she sees the value of it even from her own standpoint. So to say that every Democrat is not listening, I think would be a misnomer.
Do you think she's listening right? Do you think she's listening at this point? Because when the vote came down, you know, all of them voted against it and one abstained.
Okay. Obviously I can't say, but here's what I can say. Politics and politicking can be a complicated game, in that some are not putting forth, you know, what they really want to see until the bill looks more like what they want to see it look like, and then they will finally vote for it. I hope that's the case, because otherwise, what's the alternative? The alternative is that these elected officials have a more than a critical mass of their constituency that they're ignoring. That's disqualifying. I cannot represent you if I ignore you.
Ms. Gardner, I think do you live in the chairman of the Black Caucus's district or close to it?
Yes, I do.
Representative Reynolds. You know, now the Black Caucus has 17 members in the House. It takes 76 votes to pass a bill out of the House and 18 out of the Senate. So what would be your message to your representative about education freedom and education savings accounts, which is school choice? What would be your message to him if he were able to listen? If he were able to hear you today?
My message would be to just engage your constituents. Come and visit with us, talk to us, and find out, you know, do more exploration about what our issues are, what our problems are, how we feel about each one of these issues, so that you can represent us properly.
And my message to the listening audience out there is, Texas Public Policy Foundation, we hear you. We're listening. And we want to make sure that your voice is heard across the state of Texas. Dr. Jones, looking at your research and looking at the data points on families, could you elaborate a little bit on the numbers as it relates to families with children in the house versus families with children outside the home?
Well, so we definitely know that people who have children living at home are going to be much more likely to support vouchers than those outside of the home. Although within the Black community, it's still a majority, even who don't have children inside. That's where it's different from the rest of the community.
It doesn't really matter in the Black community. The number is still the highest.
They're still high. It's less if there aren't children at home, but even more than half of African Americans who don't have children at home still support vouchers. And it gets up to 70% if you're talking about people who have children at home. But I think it's sort of a mixture in the broader population. But if we're thinking about the things that explain people's support for vouchers, race is a major one of them. African Americans are across the board much more likely to support it than any other racial ethnic group. And then if you start to parse in partisanship, then it's Republican Anglos and Republican Latinos are much more likely to support it than Democratic Latinos and Democratic Anglos. And finally, the other factor, as we mentioned before, is the religious issue. That is, the more, if you attend church, you're especially on a frequent weekly basis or even 2 or 3 times a month, you're much more likely to support vouchers. And part of the reason there is, as I mentioned before, the critique of vouchers that it's essentially funding religious schools is not considered to be as much of a problem for people who are not secular. So for people who are more people of faith and more religious, they don't see that as the disqualifying aspect of vouchers that someone who's more secular sees it as.
Dr. Adams, the African American community has a long history of being loyal and supporting the Democratic Party. Matter of fact, in the 2014 election, 92%, 2018, 82%, 2022, 84%, and we seem to be all in for the Democratic Party. But when it comes to something that really meets our needs and helps us in terms of an antidote to the school to prison pipeline and failing schools and being locked into certain zip codes, where is that party for the African American community?
Yeah, I would say this first of all, in terms of this project, and I'm sure Mark would agree, and also the University of Houston, Jim Granado is the dean there. What we're trying to do is to be a kind of repository or a resource in terms of, say, this is the data, and politicians or anybody who has an interest in this, you should be able to use this, and the science should speak for itself. And it's not a kind of partisan or anything like this, but I think if you look at these numbers, it clearly reveals that African Americans are concerned about education, as I said at the top of the show here. And I think there's a disconnect or there's a divide based on socioeconomic status in terms of, if you look at the overall community in terms of from the constituency side, is that we, as a community in terms of Black people, agree that there has to be something done to improve the quality of education. And this is one avenue you could add, that if you look at this survey, there seems to be a groundswell of support within the community where if you look at the debate in terms of the session, what's going on, you wouldn't know that. And I think to go back to the point there, I don't know if I want to say there's a divide, but there's a disconnect between any agenda, in particular this item, than what the Legislative Black Caucus may be speaking to on the issue of school choice.
Bishop Flowers, do you see a need for this type of education and at the grassroots level? Basically bringing this type of research and engagement to the grassroots level, maybe in a form of town hall meetings. Maybe the general public don't really have access to this data the way that we do. And I know you guys have been on, and Dr. Jones, I saw you on Channel 11 News, and I know you guys are probably going to go on some other news outlets in the Houston area. But what about in the Dallas area, San Antonio area, and around the state?
Without question, educating the public at the grassroots level is essential, because if a voter is really going to be, if they're really going to be an aid to fix their own issues, they have to be educated on those issues. there have to be educated voters. And education means that the elected officials should themselves be doing the work in their districts when they're not here at the Capitol building and not here in session. They should be in their districts educating their constituency and hearing from them on this issue, because it has so fundamentally affected the operation of the lives of their constituents. They have self-educated themselves, like this data represents. They are on this issue, although their representatives are not on it with them. They got that information from somewhere. They educated themselves because the circumstances are pressing in on them, and they see, if this is the case, how do we fix this? Now, how much more if the elected official would say in a town hall in San Antonio or Dallas or Houston to lay this out before them and get their thoughts on it, as your other guests have pointed out, listen to them, and then represent them.
There may need to be a series of town hall meetings, so we can get this information down into the grassroots, because every one of those folks who live out there in the grassroots area, in the community, if they're of age, most of them are voters, and they have an opportunity to vote, and they have an opportunity to let their voice be heard. So tell me, how do you feel? Do you think that maybe some town hall meetings or some ways of getting engaged in the grassroots with this kind of knowledge? This comes from the university level, and sometimes it's a little challenging getting it to seep down into the grassroots level, but this may be a way that it could be done.
Yeah, I think that's critical. I think we have an example happening right now in HISD, where and HISD is the district that I hail from. That's the district that produced me. And what I know is that the data shows that over the last 20 years, we have kids in my community that have been, these schools have been failing repeatedly, up to the point to where our school district got taken over. So if that's not serious, I don't know what else is. And then the other thing is that when you talk about grassroots and you talk about education, we have a grassroots community that is just walking into the voting booth just not knowing. They don't know. They have not been educated. They don't know. And they just go in there and just, do a Hail Mary, basically, because they have not been educated by the people who should be educating them. And frankly, it was just a shame that our school district got taken over like that. After 20 years, we're going to let these schools fail repeatedly. And now some of the kids that went through those schools that didn't get educated properly, now they're parents. And they're not prepared for the workforce. They're not prepared for the 21st century. That's robbery.
Well, and I see your point, and I hear your passion, because I believe that if we are able to connect the academic community and the knowledge base that's coming out of the academic community down into the grassroots, it can be transformational. And just like this study, because one of the things we hear a lot in the African American community when it comes to school choice, that's for rich people. They'll come out and the leadership comes out in our community and say that's for rich people, elite people, and then they say it's for rich white Republican people, but it's not for African Americans. We don't want that, when we have the majority of our community crying out for it. And so if we as a community, the electorate, the larger body of our community stand up and say, look, here's what we want. I think research like this, it has to be data driven. And that's why I'm so grateful to Dr. Adams and Dr. Jones and the U of H and Texas Southern University for bringing forward some data, some real data, the science. It doesn't matter what party you're in, Democrat, Republican, it doesn't matter what your demographic may be. The numbers are the numbers. You may love or hate Richard Johnson, but at the end of the day, whether you love me or hate me, it's not going to change the numbers on this paper.
Right.
And the numbers in this study. And when we begin to look at things from a scientific perspective, well, you hear that a lot, follow the science. Well, if we follow the science, then, automatically there would be 17 additional votes that we could count on up at the House coming up for this school choice vote. But, Dr. Adams, I want to pitch it back to you in terms of, recommendations going forward. Because what you and Dr. Jones have done, you've opened our eyes to an issue in the African American community that most people thought our community was against school choice. Most people, if you go ask them, they say, no, the African American community is against school choice. Well, when you look at the data, it doesn't say the African American community is against school choice. It says that the African American elected officials may be against school choice. But there may be some other areas that this same situation may exist that we just don't know about. There may be other issues.
Yeah, I think if you look at the caucus, I don't know how heavily they're invested in terms of research that drives many of their decision, and that could be something in terms of, as a community, there should be some connection in terms of what the community is thinking. And I think this survey, it speaks to one element of that in terms of looking at education. But you cannot be in a body and you make your legislative decisions, and if it's not data driven and if it's out of sync with the community. So again, it would help to have a kind of research organ, if you will. And I know going back, looking at the history of Texas Southern University, I've been there for a long time, but there was the creation of 2 centers, and they were supposed to be a repository for producing reports and what have you, but that's not the case anymore. But what I'm saying, and I basically took it upon myself to reach out and to work with scholars like Mark and my friends over at the University of Houston, because we live in a city and we live in a state. And I think that the choices that our legislators, I'm talking about the 150 members of the House and the 31 state senators, they need access to information where they can make sound public policy decisions for the benefit of all Texans.
Dr. Johnson, I wanted to point out here, I know that these 17 Black Caucus members certainly do need to put their eyes on this research and follow what is clearly demonstrated within the data, the desires of their constituencies. However, I don't want to let the other side of the issue off the hook either. There are 86 Republicans in the House. You only need 76 votes to get the bill passed. So in a real sense, it's not the Democrats by the sheer numbers that's keeping school choice from happening. It's rural Republicans that's keeping it from happening. And so because if all of those Republican votes were for school choice, that bill would be out of the House already. So this school to prison pipeline piece, because in the rural areas, prisons are built there. And schools, obviously, are there for the education of the children. So the 2 institutions within rural Texas that keeps people's jobs and lifestyles intact is the schools and the prisons. School choice among those constituencies sometimes feel like school choice would break up that monopoly, and we wouldn't be able to have the same kind of prison population or the same kind of school population that we right now have. I would say to those rural Republicans, don't hide behind your R because the majority of Republicans are in support of school choice. Stand up and recognize that this issue is not just important for their own constituency, but for students across the face of Texas. And so they should be voting for it outside of their own particular interest. Sometimes every time when a politician acts within the scope of their own interest, they're no longer acting on the interest of those they're representing. And that's the whole purpose for being there, isn't it? To operate on the basis of the people you represent, not your own interest.
And I think you're right. We all have a responsibility as Texans to make Texas the freest state and the best place to live in America. That's our job as Texans. But we need the collaboration with both parties, but we also need the collaboration with our higher educational institutions. Because I agree wholeheartedly with Dr. Adams. We have to have the data. We have to make informed, data-driven decisions. Because without this data, the message goes out into our community, and I've heard it and you've heard it, that this is not going to help African Americans. This is not a bill to help us. This is not good for us. But we heard those kind of things about closing the school to prison pipeline. And so one of the things that these parents are doing and these respondents are doing, and I'm hearing them loud and clear, they're asking for another way out. They're pleading for another way out. They're crying for another way out. And it's so far has fallen on deaf ears to the folks who are actually representing them. And so if they can't hear them, then we have to hear them. And they have to have some outlet to get their voice out. And that's the reason why I'm so glad that we're here today at this roundtable. Dr. Jones, what are you seeing in terms of the opportunity or what would you recommend in terms of the opportunity for collaboration moving forward and getting this data out into the grassroots?
Well, I think probably one of the best ways to do that is a series of of town halls targeted to the areas where there's the greatest demand and interest, which would be primarily here in Houston, Harris County, Austin, Dallas, and then San Antonio would be the major areas. Although, I wouldn't want to miss Beaumont and Jefferson County as well, because that's an important area. But I think those types of meetings where the information can get out there, both. So I think in terms of for the direct audience at those events, but then the more town halls you have, you can have greater media coverage of them. So both in terms of specialized media focused on the African American community, as well as broader general media. That's another way to as a megaphone to get the information out there to the broader public, because that is really the challenge, is getting the information to the public that is busy with their daily lives. They don't follow politics like the five of us do. And so they're focused on raising their kids at their jobs. And so it often takes more to break the breakthrough barriers to get that information to them so that they're aware.
And so we're down to the last few minutes of the show. And this is the opportunity that I give everybody to we're going to leave on a good note. And so we're going to go around the round table, and if you have anything, what could you say right now is the most positive thing about where we are with the school choice and what we can look forward to?
Well, we are where we have never been before. The school choice fight has been going on for a long time, and we've never come this close to it. That says that there's something fundamentally at the grassroots that is moving in the direction of school choice rather than away from it. That the House had to actually formulate a school choice bill is unheard of. But they had to do it because the issue was snowballing. I'm thankful for both the governor and lieutenant governor's commitment to keep calling our legislators back until something happens in this positively where school choice is concerned. So we're not where we were. We're not where we need to be. But thank God we're not where we were with this issue.
Over to you.
Well, I know that there are private schools in the African American community, and I know the owners of those schools, and it seems as though they feel like they could use the money from the vouchers and that it would benefit their schools. So, and I'm just in favor of choice because we've got a lot of work to do. We've lost a couple of generations of students because of poor quality education in the community, and we got to find multiple ways to dig ourselves out of this hole we've been falling in for a very long time.
Dr. Adams.
I would just like to say in closing, I think that the politicians and everybody who's involved in this debate, they should really focus on the students or the children, and also if they connect with the parents of those children, they would get an understanding in terms of how they would rank order their priorities and all of the policy that they pursue. And I do understand both sides because historically, as a Black person, in terms of looking at the fight coming out of segregation to desegregation, to address these kinds of issues. But again, I think the time and place now in terms of looking at workforce development, in terms of looking at industry coming into the state of Texas, we have to have a workforce that's prepared, and education is that key. And every student who matriculates deserves a quality and a good education and a sound education.
Dr. Jones?
Yes, it's just a final note. I would say that, a positive thing is that in the African American community is blessed by a very strong church infrastructure. So the African American church is very strong, very well organized. And if school choice legislation is passed, is in a very good position to be able to mobilize the resources, both from a voluntary perspective as well as from a faith-based perspective, to effectively fill the void and essentially fill the need. There's often, I think, a mistake where people tend to focus on a voucher is never going to pay to go to an elitist school like St. John's or Kincaid or Hockaday. But the reality is the churches have shown that they can run, and that's not just African American churches. A lot of churches can run a good, high quality private school on something pretty close to a voucher. And if it's a little less, they can have scholarships, parents can pay, or the church itself will contribute as part of their mission. So I think so for the African American community in particular, that there's a ready-made set of churches that could fill the void pretty quickly in terms of providing this education if school choice legislation is passed. So at least if the concern is that there aren't going to be enough schools, and quality schools, I don't think, at least with the African American community, that that's the case. That is, that the churches are strong enough, and in any given Sunday tells you that. You can drive by the parking lots.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank everybody for being with us today. We've had a great discussion on the round table and Voices of Freedom. And so we want the public to know that if the world does not listen to you, Texas Public Policy Foundation, we will listen, we will hear you, we will listen to you, and we will make sure that the rest of the world hears you. I'm Dr. Richard Johnson, and I'm the director of the Booker T. Washington Initiative here at Texas Public Policy Foundation. Thank you for being with us. Thank all of you.